Good afternoon, everyone. Let's start. I understand that this weather deters some people, but we'll keep having people coming in. It is my pleasure to introduce a dear friend and esteemed scholar, Professor Ben Natans of the University of Pennsylvania. Ben is the author of a groundbreaking book on Russian Jewry in the late imperial era, Beyond the Pale, a book that is a canon in the bibliography of both Imperial Russia and Russian Jewish history. Many of us know him also from his reviews, very thoughtful reviews in the New York Review of Books, the TLS, and many other public journals. And recently he published his magnum opus that you can find just outside of the door after the lecture, to the success of our hopeless cause, the many lives of the Soviet dissident movement, a brilliant magnum opus, and a very short one, 800-something pages, the Russian says Takaya Papka, and probably the definitive book of the Soviet dissident movement, based on amazing, stunning research for many years in every possible archive, diaries, memoirs, and interviews with the protagonists. Simply a must book for Soviet, post-Soviet history. Today, Professor Natans will talk about a segment from his book, about the guide for the Soviet dissidents that they wrote for themselves, how to handle the good fellows of the KGB, and what the KGB has done with this. It is my pleasure again to welcome Professor Natans. Please join me.
Thank you, Amir, for that very kind introduction. I've known Amir for a long time. We discovered at some point that we went to the same elementary school in Rehovot, midway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. He was a lifer. I was just there for a year. But I have gained so much from Amir's work, including for this project on the dissidents, because it involves the KGB as a major actor, and he's been my go-to source for that. And it goes without saying, at least for me, that it's always a pleasure to come to Stanford. I have workshopped parts of this book here several times over the past few years, and Amir mentioned the archives that went into the research for this book, and one of the most important ones among those archives, probably as important as any other, was the Hoover. I'm happy to go into detail in the Q&A about what it was that the Hoover has for a history of the Soviet dissident movement, but it's really a tremendous resource. So thank you for bringing me here. I appreciate it. The game plan today is I'm going to talk for about 50 or 55 minutes while you're having lunch, and then we'll have the rest of the session for a Q&A, and I welcome comments and questions about any aspect of what I'm about to say to you. As Amir mentioned, my remarks today are drawn from my book that came out last summer, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. The title of the book, as many of you may know, comes from a dissident toast and manages to capture that ineffable quality of bringing together boldness and despair, the ability to be to practice a kind of perseverance at the same time as having a sense that one's quest is probably not going to be successful. Something we might learn from in our own certain predicament. And the subtitle of the book, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, has a double meaning. It's kind of a play on words. The first meaning is to draw attention to the people who mostly have become forgotten figures in the history of this movement, the people who weren't the marquee names, who didn't get the Nobel Prizes, who weren't on the cover of Time magazine or Der Spiegel, and who didn't become household names all over the world, Andrei Sakharov, Andrei Solzhenitsyn, others. They obviously figure importantly in this story, but in the process of doing my work, I became convinced that the people who really invented the movement propelled it and lived through its various transformations, about which more in a second, had been utterly forgotten. So those are the many lives that I'm trying to bring back to the surface in telling this story. The second meaning of the subtitle, Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, is that the movement underwent several near-death experiences during the course of its roughly 2-decade-long existence from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s. And so it passed through several lives. And I wanted to not only understand how it survived those near-death experiences, but to explore the way it reinvented itself and reformatted itself after each of those near catastrophes. At its heart, my study is a political history of a movement that claimed to be apolitical. And that's one of the central paradoxes. I proceed from the assumption that Soviet dissidents were Soviet people, and that the key to understanding that movement is to ask why that kind of a movement could have emerged from that kind of society. I'm trying to not see the dissidents as surrogate soldiers of liberalism, who just by accident of fate, ended up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, fighting the Western battle of the Cold War in the name of liberal values. I try to see them instead as products of their own time, their own place, their own society. It may sound banal to say Soviet dissidents were Soviet people, like what else would they be? But I think if you explore the history of the movement that they made in light of that fact, that they were Soviet people, bringing Soviet ingredients to their own goals, their own aspirations, you can actually learn a lot about the inner history of the movement. So I'm very fond of a kind of theatrical scheme of Soviet history in which there are two main acts. And the first act is the one that, at least until recently, has tended to suck up all the attention. That's the one that has the revolution and the Civil War and the purges and the terror and the Second World War and levels of violence and drama that really cannot be outdone. Certainly weren't outdone in the 20th century. And the second half of Soviet history, the post-Stalinist half, has tended to get less attention because it doesn't offer anything that can quite rival the violent drama of the first half. Nonetheless, I think a lot of very important and interesting things went on in the second act of Soviet history, and they form the background to my investigation. So let me just give you a very schematic sense of what the second half of Soviet history, or the second act of that drama, means for the history of the dissident movement. As Amir has shown in his own work, the great challenge of the Soviet system after Stalin died was to see if it could remove the practice of mass state-sponsored terror from the menu of governing practices, from the repertoire of state practices that held the system up. Could it simply rely, or I shouldn't say simply, could it rely on the other two main strategies of governance, namely one-party rule and the command economy, subtract mass terror from the equation, and still run a country, still have the Soviet Union being a going concern? That was a remarkably bold experiment that Khrushchev embarked on, to subtract terror from the repertoire of governing and to see what happened. Lots of things happened. Terror, mass terror, and I mean terror in the classic sense of the word as the more or less random application of violence, which is the way you instill maximum fear in the maximum number of people, because nobody can consider themselves safe when terror is part of the repertoire of governing techniques. So lots of things happened as a consequence for that, but one of the most important things for my purposes is that removing terror from the way the Soviet Union governed its population opened up the space in which something like public dissent was even thinkable or possible. It was simply impossible to have the kind of movement that emerged in the mid-1960s in the context of the Stalinist system. Another consequence of the retreat from mass terror was Khrushchev's condemnation of the cult of personality that was both cause and effect of the terror campaigns and to replace it, at least in theory, with socialist legality. The emphasis that on the idea that what Stalin really did most wrong in his time in power was to ignore the law, whether it was the laws of history or the laws created by the Soviet state, gave a kind of prominence to the restoration of legal procedure that was also very important for the dissident movement. And one of the early protagonists in this story, I won't be talking much about him today, but he figures prominently in the book, is a Moscow mathematician named Alexander Volpin, who, in a series of intellectual permutations derived from his own field of mathematical logic, eventually came upon the idea that trying to get the Soviet government to obey its own laws would be a good way of exercising something that looks like containment over the behavior of that state. It wasn't enough for the state to renounce the use of violence. Volpin and eventually his disciples and large swaths of the dissident movement as a whole also had the aspiration of transforming the Soviet Union into a rule of law society. So initially, the KGB was on board with Khrushchev's turn to socialist legality, and they genuinely tried to professionalize themselves, to extract themselves from the almost unspeakable dungeon practices that had become routine in the 1930s and 40s. So the KGB, along with the rest of the Soviet state, is attempting to abide by Soviet law, at least to the best of its abilities. And when they arrested dissidents, it was because the dissidents had done something. You could contest whether that something was legal or not, but this was not a random sweep up of people who had no idea why they had been dragged to the Lubyanka or other prisons. So the KGB attempts to use the legal system to prosecute its cases against the dissidents. They have trials. Those trials are not absolutely perfect from a procedural point of view. There are all kinds of asymmetries between the defense and the prosecution, but they're not Moscow show trials either. The defendants do not get tortured or beaten up in advance. Many of them, or at least some of them, find the courage to plead not guilty, something that would have been unthinkable in the 1930s and 1940s in the famous show trials. The problem is that even though in, in virtually every case, the KGB gets the verdict it wants, and it gets it because it phones in the verdict to the judge before the trial starts, it gets the verdict it wants, guilty, sentenced to whatever it is, 3, 5, 7 years, but the political dividends that the trials are supposed to deliver almost always go in the opposite direction. These trials make, in some cases, unknown, obscure individuals into martyrs, into global figures being persecuted by this gigantic Soviet state. And eventually, the KGB becomes disillusioned with using legal strategies and legal instruments to make its case against dissidents. And it starts backing away from courtroom trials and instead using extrajudicial techniques. Not torture, not usually beating, but things like calling people in for conversations to intimidate them, calling their relatives in, making sure people's salaries get cut in half or they get fired from their jobs, having people kicked out of graduate school, all these things done without any semblance of scrutiny by legal institutions. It's just the division of the KGB, the 5th Division, is responsible for crushing the dissidents, simply deciding who to call and who to punish according to their own lights. It's against this background of the retreat from judicial techniques to something that looks not exactly like Stalinism, but very, very arbitrary and not subject to any kind of appeal system. It's against that background that the genre of text that I want to talk with you about today comes into being, and that is the dissident advice manuals, guides to behavior and to thinking about these increasingly widespread contexts with an extrajudicial KGB. Like most Soviet citizens in the late Soviet era, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, dissidents tended to take for granted that the USSR was going to be around for decades, if not centuries. As the title of the famous book has it, everything was forever. The Soviet Union was a forever state. And given that forever quality, or seemingly forever quality, the most urgent question was no longer what is to be done, but the more existential, how should you conduct yourself? How should you be? How should you behave? What should you say? What should your comportment be like under this steady state, soft totalitarian regime? And this is the question that gave rise to the conduct manuals. Now, like all conduct literature, dissident manuals are prescriptive. They tell you what you're supposed to do. They tell us, people who read them now, more about norms and ideals than about actual behavior. So I'm not reading them as descriptions of what dissidents did when they were being interrogated, or had to serve as witness at trials, or were having their apartments searched, or any of the other invasive behaviors practiced by the KGB. And it's precisely because they are prescriptive documents that I think they have their specific value. That is, they are windows into conversations about dissident ethics regarding relations between the individual and the Soviet state. And I'm trying to mine them for implicit models of freedom and dignity that animate these works. And I'm trying to ask what they reveal not only about their authors, but about their implied readers. So the story begins with a samizdat pamphlet that was prepared by none other than Alexander Volpin himself, that mathematical logician who I mentioned a minute ago, and it was called Legal Memorandum for Those Facing Interrogation. For years, Volpin had been explaining to anybody who would listen how to deploy the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure during encounters with the security apparatus. He never had a shortage of interested listeners, because by the late 1960s, the Fifth Directorate of the KGB, the one responsible for handling domestic dissent, was conducting on average 10,000 what it called prophylactic conversations per year. 10,000 Soviet citizens were being invited to come down to the local KGB office and have a little talk with their local agent. These were meant to be proactive, sort of strike before an actual crime has been committed in an attempt to head off that criminal activity or suspected anti-Soviet activity. Now, despite the fear that these conversations produced, not to mention actual interrogations in actual criminal cases, many of them served, at least for dissidents, as a kind of privileged moment of truth. Hundreds, if not thousands, of open letters and petitions had been signed and sent to Soviet authorities over the years. And not one of them, literally not one, at least that I've been able to find, ever produced a written reply. The only answer to dissident petitions and open letters was the reprisals that happened against those who wrote them and who signed their names, sometimes gave their addresses and phone numbers in the spirit of transparency, of glasnost. So there was really no hope, certainly by the end of the 1960s, for anything that looked like an open dialogue with the state. Interrogation or an interview by a KGB officer was therefore the closest that most dissidents would ever come to a face-to-face encounter with a representative of the Soviet government. This was the moment when you could finally speak your truth to power. For other thinkers, as a dissident named Gleb Pavlovsky recalled, he was a student in Odessa at Odessa State University who was kicked out of the Komsomol in 1969. For other thinkers, which is what they like to call, what we call dissidents, meeting with the organs is a climactic moment. You've been waiting for this forever. Even hardened veterans of the Gulag were susceptible to this fantasy of direct communication with the Soviet state. When he was sitting in a cell in Lefortovo prison following his arrest in February 1974, Solzhenitsyn was suddenly handed a suit and tie and told, "Let's go." Where to? I had no doubt, to the government, to that very Politburo of theirs, now, finally, for the first and last time, we would have a conversation. As I walked away from the cell, I was conversing with the Politburo in my mind. I had this certain feeling that over the course of 2 or 3 hours, I could move them in certain respects, shake them loose. It was impossible to get through to the fanatics of Lenin's Politburo or to the sheep of Stalin's. But these fellows, absurd as it may sound, I thought it was possible. He never got the chance. Solzhenitsyn was whisked off not to the Politburo, but to Sheremetyevo airport, where he was stripped of his Soviet citizenship and expelled to West Germany. As these accounts or these fantasies suggest, encounters with Soviet officials were also moments of truth about oneself. They tested one's character, one's loyalty to friends, one's mental agility, and not least, one's physical and moral stamina in the midst of a verbal duel that could go on for hours at a time. Insofar as dissidents were engaged in partisan warfare with the Soviet state, interrogations represented the combat zone, the scene of intense psychological drama. They had been, for a long time, the object of cultural fascination, from the iconic encounter between Jesus and the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's The Brother Karamazov from 1880, to Arthur Koestler's haunting depiction of the communist Nikolai Rubashov's confrontations with Stalin's NKVD in the novel Darkness at Noon. And this continues to the interrogations of the Decembrist revolutionaries depicted in Natan Eidelman's widely read historical novel Lunim from 1970. The existential question in these encounters was how to conduct yourself under pressure. That's the way the popular science fiction writers Arkady and Buddy Strugatsky put it in their 1976 novel, A Billion Years Before the End of the World. For Boris Strugatsky, this was by no means a purely fictional scenario, because in 1973, 3 years before the novel appeared, he himself had been subjected to an 8-hour interrogation by the Leningrad KGB as part of a case against his friend Mikhail Heifetz, who had written an introduction to a samizdat collection of poems by the exiled Joseph Brodsky. By his own account, a, quote, grotesquely inexperienced witness, Strugatsky was caught lying and threatened with prosecution. That is, he was at risk of going from being a witness to a defendant. The encounter, as he put it, and here I'm quoting, left an indelible impression and colored the entire atmosphere of A Billion Years. For some dissidents, mostly men, interrogations provided the functional equivalent of war stories. They could be told around kitchen tables, preferably highlighting the protagonist's heroism and cleverness in contrast to the ham-fisted malevolence of the KGB. How we laugh when we come home from interrogations, proclaimed another mathematician, Vladimir Albrecht, who experienced more than a dozen himself. You could ramp up this telling of war stories in the manner of Pavel Litvinov, one of the early important figures in the dissident movement. He was the grandson of Maxim Litvinov, Stalin's foreign minister. Pavel Litvinov was hauled before a KGB agent in September of 1967 in one of these prophylactic conversations, and the agent said to him in so many words, "We know you're preparing the transcript of a recent trial, and I just want to let you know that if that transcript ever sees the light of day, not only you, but your friends will be arrested for anti-Soviet activity." And Litvinov got into a whole back and forth with him, disputing the idea that creating a transcript of a Soviet trial could possibly be illegal, since the only words in the transcript were those that had been uttered in a courtroom, a Soviet courtroom. But he went beyond just returning to his or someone else's kitchen to recount this conversation. Instead, as soon as he left the prison, he wrote everything down and got as close to a verbatim transcript as he could, and he made sure that that got to a Western journalist, and several weeks later, that transcript was read, kind of audiobook style, as a drama over the BBC. So millions of Soviet listeners were able to hear that particular encounter. Much later, in the late 1970s, another dissident named Alexander Podrabinek, who was an emergency medical technician at the time, and who got in trouble with the KGB for smuggling out documents about the punitive use of psychiatry against suspected dissidents. He took the documentary impulse even further. He brought a tape recorder surreptitiously in with him to the prophylactic conversation, recorded the whole thing, and then studied the dialogue over and over again in an attempt to figure out how he could better deal with the KGB the next time such a thing happened. Studying transcripts of interrogation, however, could only do so much to strengthen your position during future questioning by the KGB. If any of you who have ever seen an interrogation transcript, and there are several of them in the collections at the Hoover that I used for this book, you'll know that they are kind of like a chess move list. So after a chess game has been played, sometimes it's written about, if there's a chess column. The chess move list is literally that. It's a step-by-step record of what moves each side made sequentially. But what a chess move list fails to capture, of course, are the moves that each player considered at any given moment, and the larger strategies that they sought to advance, including the use of bluff, intimidation, and distraction. It also does not capture the strategies they believed their opponents were following, not to mention not capturing the blood pressure, hunger level, alertness, anxiety, exhilaration, and fatigue, along with the attendant body language and facial expressions. All of those things are lost in chess moves, and they're also lost from transcripts of interrogation, whether those interrogations happened in the 30s or the 70s or whenever. So like chess moves, transcripts are two-dimensional representations of experiences that involve far more than 2 dimensions. Alexander Volpin, the intellectual godfather of the legalist approach to dissent, believed that the key to withstanding pressure during an interrogation, pressure that could easily lead to unintended self-incrimination or even worse, incriminating of others, was to be found in the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure. It was very common for interrogators to begin by referencing the procedural rules that governed such encounters, mentioning the number of the Code of Criminal Procedure or the Soviet Constitution that was relevant, but they wouldn't explain the relevant clauses or articles. They would just reference them. And so in 1969, Volpin took it upon himself to compose a short samizdat guide to the legal rights of witnesses and defendants during criminal investigations. This became a samizdat document disseminated under the title, How to Conduct Yourself at an Interrogation. It was a how-to guide. It provided a host of practical suggestions, each one accompanied by a citation to the relevant article of either the Code or the Constitution. I'm not going to go through all of his advice. I'll just mention a couple things. Strongly discouraged people from citing drunkenness, which was the classic Russian way to get out of a charge of anti-Soviet behavior. You say you drank too much and you said stuff you never meant to say. It didn't really indicate anti-Soviet attitudes. You shouldn't do this because it doesn't offer you protection from prosecution, he claimed. And the Code for Criminal Procedure offered no loopholes for people who'd been inebriated. He pointed out that at any interrogation which was not specifically connected to a criminal investigation or a trial, and that covers the prophylactic conversations, witnesses had the right without penalty to refuse to answer questions, which almost nobody knew, but it was true. He also pointed out that it was prohibited to ask leading questions in these encounters. He reminded his readers that both defendants and witnesses had the right to write down their answers in their own hand, rather than having the interrogator or an assistant to the interrogator do so. And he highly recommended this as a strategy for slowing down the conversation, slowing down the proceedings of the interrogation, opening up extra time to think and to strategize. He also had a host of extremely technical suggestions, such as reminding one's interrogator that the phrase Soviet power refers to the organs of power outlined in the Soviet Constitution. Constitutions are power maps, among other things. And that therefore any accusation of anti-Soviet behavior needed to be confined to behavior that was opposed to the forms of Soviet power outlined in the Soviet Constitution, and no more expansive understanding of what Soviet power meant. I won't go into all of the other technical explanations, but there were many, and we know from archival sources that exasperated KGB investigators who found themselves entangled in these kinds of cat and mouse interchanges were known to throw up their hands and declare, "You've been reading Volpin." Indeed, this manual, How to Conduct Yourself at an Interrogation, quickly became the samizdat equivalent of a bestseller. It had small format samizdat editions that were smuggled abroad in the technique known as samizdat, published in New York and in Paris, New York in 1973, Paris in 1975, also in small editions suitable for smuggling back into the Soviet Union. As the memorandum itself noted, there would have been little need for such a guide if the KGB had not restricted the pool of available defense attorneys by requiring special permission to work on so-called political cases. So just as samizdat circumvented Soviet censorship by turning readers into do-it-yourself publishers, all you needed was a typewriter, onion skin paper, and carbon paper in order to become a publisher and multiplier of samizdat texts, so Volpin's memorandum responded to restrictions on the legal profession by coaching defendants and witnesses to become do-it-yourself lawyers. One of the questions that came up in the conversation surrounding Volpin's manual was, is it ever permissible or advisable to lie to the KGB during an interrogation? I say lie as distinct from not revealing the truth. We know from the editor and history teacher Ludmila Alexeyeva that she, at least, and her friends thought it was permissible to lie. The extreme asymmetry of power, in her view, marked interrogations as a moral state of exception. Volpin himself, by contrast, had concluded that the fundamental task of ethics was the eradication of lying. And so one of the purposes of his memorandum was to provide witnesses and defendants with legal alternatives to lying, which he opposed on both practical as well as ethical grounds. Lying, he pointed out, had a tendency to metastasize, and an exposed lie invariably gave additional leverage to one's interrogator. Volpin was hardly the only person who advocated not lying during interrogations, and for that matter, not lying in society at large either. The computer scientist Valentin Turchin, whose papers are at the Hoover, wrote, "We have become so accustomed to mass systematic lying that we consider it not only completely permissible, but even utterly natural and necessary for maintaining public order. We consider it quite normal to say one thing at home and among friends, and precisely the opposite in public." As an initial antidote to this set of circumstances, Turchin offered a minimal code of behavior. Never, under any circumstances, either directly or indirectly, enable the spread of disinformation, lies, or slander. At meetings of any kind, he wrote this in 1969, do not vote in favor of decisions if you are unsure of whether they're just. In elections of any kind, do not give your vote to any individual whose honesty you doubt. End quote. How to Conduct Yourself at an Interrogation inaugurated a distinct and widely consumed genre within the world of samizdat, and this was the Dissident Conduct Manual. By the end of the 1970s, there were at least half a dozen such guides. They covered situations ranging from interrogations to apartment searches to interviews by psychiatrists and to life in general. One samizdat activist reports having typed Volpin's manual, quote, 100 times. I learned it by heart. And she wasn't the only one. The KGB produced its own in-house copies of dissident conduct manuals, the better to understand their domestic enemies. Unlike most conduct literature, these guides were not part of a civilizing mission, intended to transmit mores and manners to a benighted audience. Dissident conduct manuals were produced by people who themselves
had experienced the kinds of encounters that they sought to analyze. Their readers had too, or at least they anticipated doing so in the future. Their goal was to help future subjects of interrogations or apartment searches or other interactions with the KGB manage the attendant fear and uncertainty and emerge with their dignity intact. An interrogation gone wrong could jeopardize many things, including one's ability to live with oneself. Giving in to pressure to name names or reveal the location of a cache of samizdat was known to induce deep depression or even suicide. How should we live in order to respect ourselves? Asked Arseny Raginsky, who at the time edited a samizdat journal devoted to the history of Stalinism and would go on to lead the post-Soviet Memorial Society, which was liquidated shortly before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine almost 3 years ago. Conduct manuals offered answers to that question. For the dissident Andrea Malrich, it was not so much fear that induced widespread inaction, but the sense that, as he put it, nothing's going to change in any case. The apparent hopelessness of changing the Soviet system, at least in the short term, did not, however, preclude the possibility of changing oneself. Whatever its continuing world historical ambitions, by the 1960s, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had largely lost the appetite for policing the inner lives of the Soviet populace. Emancipation from cognitive and emotional reflexes conditioned by the Soviet system, from what the dissident philosopher Vladimir Zelensky, no relation to the current president of Ukraine, called idiocratic consciousness. This is more or less the same thing that the historian Jochen Hellbeck has termed Soviet subjectivity. The idea that you could emancipate yourself from that consciousness was at least conceivable at the individual level, if not in public life. While they could serve as powerful tools of psychic freedom, the strategies of inner emigration, or what Joseph Brodsky called the science of ignoring reality, one of his great phrases, was not much help during interrogations or apartment searches or any of the other increasingly common encounters with the security services. Nor, for that matter, was conscience, moral intuition that was so prized by at least one wing of the dissident movement as a guide to behavior. Under intense, methodical, hours-long interrogation by the KGB, your inner voice was not always the best counselor. They're constantly sending the message, we know everything, you just need to confirm, recounted the poet Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who herself was a prominent advocate of conscience as a guide to activism. But they're far from knowing everything, she continued, and you shouldn't fear them. You should fear yourself. Volpin urged his readers to use juridical techniques to prevent misjudgments driven by fear or panic or faulty intuition. These techniques had the advantage of being grounded in official Soviet documents that could be cited chapter and verse. They also had notable drawbacks, especially if you were neither a lawyer nor a logician like Volpin. His methods were highly technical and required extensive memorization. Another mathematician, Vladimir Albrecht, underwent multiple interrogations and became himself a dedicated collector of stories about encounters with the KGB. During the 1970s, Albrecht produced no less than 4 conduct manuals, at least 2 of which were smuggled abroad, published in Tamizdat, and brought back into the USSR. The most famous of these was called How to Be a Witness, Как быть свидетелем. And it too, like Volpin's, went through multiple editions. I thought about showing you PowerPoint images of some of these slides, but I've kind of had it up to here with PowerPoint. And instead I thought I'd actually bring one and pass it around so that you can see. This is a Tamizdat, Paris 1983 reprint of How to Be a Witness. So just pass this around the room, please treat it gently. It's my personal copy, and hopefully it'll make its way back to me by the end of the hour. So Albrecht's manuals pushed boundaries of the genre in multiple directions. To begin with, unlike Volpin's, his are very funny. They parody, one of them parodies the famous opening line of the hymn of the Soviet Air Force. For those of you who are not up on the hymn of the Soviet Air Force, it starts with the line, "We were born to make a fable real." Мы рождены, чтобы сказку сделать былью. Albrecht, as an epigram to one of his manuals, wrote, "Мы рождены, чтобы Kafku сделать былью." We were born to make Kafka real. They also assume, his guides, a certain intimacy with the reader, addressing him or her directly in the manner of a 19th century mock conversational literary style known as skaz. So, an excerpt from one of them. "Did you know, reader, that the investigator obtains his results with the help of no fewer than 18 techniques? You might enjoy asking which technique he's trying to unsuccessfully use with you and advise him to use a different one." The most striking thing about Albrecht's manuals, apart from their playful authorial voice, is their attention to the inner state of the participants. What started out as a purely documentary genre, the interrogation as a move list in 2 dimensions, had, with Volpin's incorporation of extra-textual information about Soviet law, acquired a 3rd dimension. Albrecht adds further dimensions to create an almost novelistic effect, as in this account of the prelude to one of his interrogations in 1972. And I'll try to be brief because I see I'm starting to run short of time. Unfortunately, I am afraid. Fear arises when it becomes clear that neither hearing nor sight nor smell nor touch are of any use. There's just no way to deploy them. How do you block fear? With a good joke? No, only with a good thought. One will come to me momentarily. Now we've arrived and we're inside the interrogator's office. On the wall, there's Lenin. I feel better already. Take a seat, please. My name is Anatoly Gavrilovich Zhuchkov. My job is to interrogate you as a witness, but first I will explain your rights and obligation. While he speaks, I try to lower my blood pressure. It's kind of a stream of consciousness version of an interrogation with all of those missing dimensions that can't be captured in a simple move list. Albrecht offers a subjective and possibly fictionalized, but in certain ways more realistic version of the interrogation experience, including arguments, silences, and mental associations uncaptured by the official protocol. Zhuchkov mentions his birthday, which unintentionally triggers in Albrecht a flashback to the day his father was arrested in the 1930s, and readers are thus perhaps less likely to be caught off guard by the multiplicity of their own associative thoughts and emotions while being interrogated. Albrecht's manuals also provided memorable advice on how to respond or not respond to potentially fraught questions. Never acknowledge that a given samizdat text is anti-Soviet. Never claim, if said text is discovered during an apartment search, that it doesn't belong to you. Both of these would signal guilt of one kind or another. Quote, "You never have to justify yourself or prove anything. The burden of proof is always on them and them alone." Instead of invoking Volpin's procedural fine points during interrogation, Albrecht favored a studied naivete. So if Volpin advised channeling your inner lawyer, Albrecht illustrated how to channel your inner holy fool. The best answers, he advised, were honest but not concrete, bold but naive. And sometimes the best answer to your interrogator might be a question. Aggressive or unacceptable questioning during an interrogation needed to be called out and, if possible, entered into the protocol itself. As an example, I request that the investigator not circle around me. I request that he not intimidate me, not blow smoke in my face, not raise his voice, not push me to answer quickly. In a word, not subject me to pressure. All of these were things that could make their way into the written record of the interrogation itself. Conversely, witnesses should not shy away from invoking moral, not just legal, standards of behavior, if only because defendants, if you were a witness in a case, the defendants in those cases had the right to read the investigatory record. And they, in the process of reading the investigation protocols leading up to the trial would be heartened to see that a witness had expressed moral solidarity with the defendant as captured in the protocol itself. All of this begs a certain question. It's, I guess, my version of the so what question. Did any of this advice matter during actual interrogations with actual KGB investigators? It's often very difficult, if not impossible, to assess the impact of conduct literature on actual conduct. Most of the examples of interrogations and searches featured in these guides stem from accounts by participants, who presumably were inclined to favor scenarios in which they got the upper hand and who were not above embellishing accounts of their own experience. In the case of Soviet dissidents, however, we have a control group. There's another means of assessment, namely the official transcripts of thousands and thousands of interrogations preserved in the KGB archives, some of which have leaked out and are now in various other repositories. Again, I cannot say enough good things about the Hoover in this regard, because there too are some fantastically interesting interrogation transcripts. Thanks to Volpin, witnesses knew that they had the option of refusing to answer a question, something that was nearly unthinkable in an era when most people just assumed that refusing itself would be a criminal act. The interrogation transcripts that I read for my book on the dissidents show that quite a few subjects used that knowledge, and some of them used it relentlessly. So there's an amazing interrogation transcript of the biologist Sergei Kovalyov, who was put on trial in Vilnius in 1979. You go through this transcript, and literally for page after page after page, this must have gone on for 5 or 6 hours, to every single question he answers, "Отказываюсь отвечать." I refuse to answer. Over and over and over again. And apparently they don't beat him, they don't insist that he answer, they just go on to the next question. But few of the other techniques outlined in these various conduct manuals have left actual traces in the interrogation transcripts, or at least the ones that I read. And the apparently limited impact of dissident conduct manuals on the pragmatics of interrogations and house searches hardly exhausts their significance, I would argue. Conduct manuals were widely reproduced via samizdat and went through multiple editions in tamizdat. They were the subjects of intense discussion and debate. Their chief impact, it seems to me, lay in the dissemination of an ideal model of dissident comportment: self-reflective, methodical, bold, stubborn, and occasionally puckish. Conduct manuals can be understood as attempts to codify and make explicit and transmit the characteristics of outstanding personalities, the dissident virtuosi, whose example was supposed to act as a magnet for others. In this sense, they were guides not just for how to behave during particularly acute encounters with Soviet power, but for how to live in the Soviet setting generally. I'm not sure you need to conduct yourself in some special way at an interrogation, Albrecht wrote. In my view, at an interrogation, you should conduct yourself like everywhere else. Everywhere you should conduct yourself deliberately, that is, thinking about each step. The Soviet Union was not going away, and there was no use pretending otherwise. A life of dignity required not just living with oneself, but finding a way to coexist with Soviet power. The peaceful coexistence that eventually characterized relations between the capitalist and communist camps, with frequent indirect breaches, especially in the global south, was predicated on a rough balance of forces between the two Cold War superpowers. Needless to say, there was never a prospect of any such balance between dissidents and the Soviet state. The question, as Albrecht formulated it, was how a normal person should conduct himself in a non-normal environment, how a good actor should act in a bad, shameful play, end quote. It was the old Christian conundrum, how to live virtuously in a fallen world. Or in Andrea Malrich's secular formulation, how free people should conduct themselves in an unfree country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have any questions, please feel free. Yes, Stefan.
First of all, thanks so much for your talk. I noticed you mentioned a lot of sources you found in archives talking about dissident manuals and their impact, but I have heard you know your book is relies very heavily on interviews. Did you see any impact of dissident manuals or influence of the stories in those manuals in people you interviewed from this era?
I can't say that they loom large in those interviews. I had a strange experience interviewing Soviet dissidents. In most cases, by the time I got to them, they'd been interviewed many, many times, dozens of times. And I had no special training in oral history. I came to it as a rookie, probably left it as a rookie too. But I found it very frustrating to get what I felt were sort of canned, rehearsed answers. There was no, I'm not implying any lack of sincerity on their part. It's just that they'd been through this routine so many times that the answer sounded pat to me. But the one technique that I found almost always worked as an icebreaker was to show up to interviews with documents from the archive. Preferably documents that they had written and had been seized in apartment searches of their own apartments. There's nothing to get a conversation jump-started than to show up with something like that in hand. And that worked really well. And occasionally, including with Alexander Volpin, who I interviewed several times, I used his legal memorandum to sort of jog his memory, which didn't need a lot of jogging because it was phenomenally accurate. But it was never really the guide itself that became the subject of conversation. It was a stepping stone to other topics. So the honest answer is they didn't loom that large in my interviews.
Then if I may ask two questions there. One is, do we have any evidence for the spread of these manuals, these guides, beyond the dissident circles? You mentioned the BBC reading out loud, etc. But did Vladimir Vladimirovich, who was summoned to the KGB, no matter where, was aware of these guides, or it was simply in the circle? And the second question is that you refer to, this will always remain a problem, but maybe your interviews shed some light. They all claim to have a high standing and sustaining the avalanche and the assault, etc. At least with the people I interviewed, and I interviewed the bad guys, they said nobody who came to my office, excuse me for the language, did not shit in their pants. And they meant that even if they were tough and they refused to answer, etc., they were afraid, they were scared, and there is an evidence that after they left the office, they were shaken, etc. Any of your protagonists actually testified to this, or they always keep? Because when you read the memoirs, it's a problem. They all were tough as a rock.
Yeah. I'll take those questions in order. So, did the dissident advice manuals reach a readership beyond the circles of the movement itself? This, of course, begs the question, where do we draw the line on the circle? Who do we define as a dissident? And this was a subject of enormous controversy at the time. There was I seem to have collect mathematical logicians. There was another mathematical logician, rather well known in his day, named Alexander Zinoviev, who once said, a lot more dissidents arrived in the United States than left the Soviet Union. Meaning people reinvented themselves conveniently when they emigrated. But when we talk about the number of dissidents, let's say we're using the definition of anyone who at any time signed an open letter or petition or authored a signed document. So we'll be text-centric for a moment and say, if you left textual evidence of your participation, you're good, you're in. The numbers of such people, it's probably in the low thousands, somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000. But as I mentioned, every year 10,000 people were being drawn into prophylactic conversations. I don't know what proportion of that group, which over the course of the dissident movement would have added up to over 150,000 people. I simply don't know what proportion of that group had read these manuals. But you could also ask the question, the way a literary scholar would, and that was, what internal evidence in these guides can we find that indicated the intended readership? And my sense is that most of the guides offer clues that the intended readership was dissidents and nobody beyond dissidents. The one person who explicitly broke out of that mold and at least aspired, and eventually he was successful, to reach a much larger reading public was Solzhenitsyn. For lack of time, I didn't go into the sort of end phase of the history of this genre, but one of the most famous entries into this catalog of dissident manuals was Solzhenitsyn's 5-page essay, which also circulated in Samizdat and Tamizdat, called Live Not by the Lie. And in his memoirs, he said the intended readership for this document was the people, the narod. He was very keen to break beyond dissident circles. I have a kind of brief reception history of that pamphlet in my book. Surprisingly, it sank like a brick when it came out. Solzhenitsyn authorized its release just on the eve of his expulsion from the country in February of 1974. And literally, for 3 years, there is no echo in the Samizdat sphere of that document, which is a very strange thing. Because by then Solzhenitsyn, he already had his Nobel Prize, and the Gulag Archipelago was unleashing shockwaves inside and outside the Soviet Union. So it's very surprising that that document did not find the kind of resonance. It was only 3 years later that a series of Samizdat responses to it came to the surface, and they make for extraordinarily interesting reading because they focus their attention on the question not so much how to behave during interrogation, but is it legal? No, not is it legal. Is it morally acceptable to essentially do what millions of Soviet citizens were already doing, using state-owned property for purposes of private enterprise? It's the beginnings of a conversation about maybe personal entrepreneurship is the way to exit this system, or at least to make it more livable. And it's all about the ethics of, let's just call it what it was, stealing property from the state to run a business on the side. So a very interesting itinerary for that document. Your second question is about this claim by Soviet KGB agents that they inspired just sheer fear in their interlocutors. I suspect that this is a mirror image of the bravado that characterizes mostly male dissidents' characterizations of their experiences on the other end of the interrogation process. But I picture this as these macho KGB agents deriving pleasure from sowing panic in their victims. What actually happened never gets captured, as you know, in interrogation transcript, because interrogation transcripts are chess move lists. He said this, she said that, he said this, she said that. You get none of the affect around those encounters. The best that we can do is to find, and occasionally you can do this, to match an officially generated interrogation transcript, either with the dissident's own rendition of that conversation, because sometimes the first thing they do when they go home is write it all down as accurately as they can, or their account of it in their memoirs. But everybody's embellishing their own role, trying to make themselves look better. The only thing we know for a fact is that there were cases in which people returned from interrogations having been broken by their interrogators, and they never recovered. Some of them did take their own lives. Some of them hung themselves out of despair of what they had been led to reveal. So I have to assume that if those are the extreme cases of panic-induced fear, there were many, many milder ones. But how often and how those sensations were induced, I can't say.
Yes, Ilaria.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Matensa. It was a very interesting this talk. I have a curiosity more than a question, because I was wondering which is the heritage of this dissident and human rights southern movements nowadays. Because, for example, today you mentioned Vladimir Albrecht, Как вести себя на описке, which was also quoted in such a way after 45 years by Nadia Tolokonnikova, which is one of the member of Pussy Riot, which in 2021 she recorded a video, a very interesting video, because she also played with this media, acting like an influencer, Instagram influencer, and she recorded this video which was titled "Как вести себя при задержании," so during the arrest, how to conduct, what to do during an arrest. So this connection, it was clear at that moment that she was appealing, so she was referring to this important document. But I was wondering if nowadays you trace some of this heritage
Sure.
also in the activities of the opponents.
Well, if I had to cite anyone as Exhibit A for the afterlife of the dissident movement in Putin's Russia, it would probably be Tolokonnikova, because she has tapped into those texts and those biographies more systematically than anybody else. It's important to note that there are countervailing views that argue that the dissidents failed, they were failures, or as Alexei Navalny once put it, why would I want to associate myself with those losers? So there's a countervailing current, at least there was until recently, in the Russian opposition that saw the dissidents of the Soviet era as something less than ideal precursors for themselves. What I can tell you is that every single one, without exception, of the dissident manuals that I have worked with has been digitized and put on the internet. And that was true at least a dozen years ago. It's not a recent phenomenon. I can also tell you that updated versions of the guides have been created, sometimes by named authors, sometimes anonymously, that try to sort of adapt them to the current Russian legal system, which differs in very important respects from the Soviet. So the genre it really does have an afterlife, and it really is used in a very pragmatic way, or was until recently, by demonstrators in the Russian Federation. Whether guides to how to conduct yourself in interrogation actually get used in interrogations is as hard to say now as it was back then. I really think that these guides need to be used not as descriptions of behavior, but as being aspirational, as telling us something about the ethical ideas of the people among whom they circulate. That's the way I choose to read them as an historian.
Thank you.
I would like to return to your previous question about leadership, possible leadership of these manuals. I do not know whether we could identify the circles of unofficial art with dissident circles, but I know that these manuals were quite widely read in the circles of dissident art and literature. Not dissident, sorry, unofficial, not politicized. One well-known Russian poet, female poet, told me about how she was summoned to interrogation to KGB and how to try to use Volkin's book in her answers, and she realized that the KGB people were very angry at her for using Volkin's book, and she started to answer to tell them that she was going late to her date, and her lover is very jealous, and she repeated this many times, and after this they released her.
Nice. I'll have to add that to my collection. Yeah, I don't know where that manual is around the room. Who has it at the moment? Okay, so the cover of that manual is a reproduction of a work of art called The Bather, I think is how you would translate it. It shows the figure of a mermaid emerging from a matchbox. And it comes out of precisely this milieu of unofficial art. How that picture ended up on the cover of that manual, I have no idea. I suspect it was decided by Inca Press in Paris, not in Moscow or anywhere else in the Soviet Union. But there's actually a visual trace of precisely the overlap.
Conflation of these circles.
Yes, the conflation of the two circles is captured in that document itself.
Then,
Yeah, so you mentioned that some dissidents viewed interrogations as kind of their opportunity to come face to face with the government. But I'm curious, what was the perspective of the KGB by dissidents? Was it an arm of the government? Was it something stopping them from communicating with the government? Was it permanent, impermanent? Like, yeah.
Well, it was as permanent as the Soviet state appeared to be. When given the choice of who to address letters and petitions to, I don't think they ever addressed them to the KGB. It was always the head of the party, the head of the state, members of the Politburo. They didn't consider the KGB to be a policy-making unit. But, you know, as they say, faute de mieux, in the absence of any better options, you're sitting in a room with a KGB officer, and so for your purposes at that moment, he is the state. And it was almost always a he doing these interrogations. So yes, they regarded the KGB functionally as the face of the state. And some of them used it as an opportunity to make their case, you know, to sort of explain why they did what they did. Others didn't want to give any more information than was necessary and were much more reticent. And those differences are captured in the interrogation transcripts quite clearly.
It's a question about your collection of mathematicians. So I'm starting to wonder whether, so your answer will have to be speculative, but I'm starting to wonder whether there is some special connection between this kind of training and the dissident response that it yielded. So Woodman is like a very special case because his brain, which came through in your discussion, his brain was wired in very special.
It's not like yours and mine.
Very special
Yes.
way, but you have this nice counterpoint of Albrecht who's, you know, is quite different and whose affect is also very, very different. So
Yeah.
I can think of a third example, Tatiana Velikanova, who's the editor of the Chronicle for a time and who, at least in the oral history very famously, was completely silent in interrogations and
Yes.
told her friends, I'm just solving math problems in my head. So is there something special about this kind of training and the kind of response that it gave rise to? Or is this an accidental connection?
It's a great question. Let's expand the parameters by saying a strikingly high proportion of dissidents were from the STEM fields. So it wasn't only mathematicians. There were also, I quoted Valentin Turchin. He was a computer scientist by training. He was actually the author of what at the time was the most widely used software in the Soviet Union, the Rifal language. So computer scientists, mathematicians, of course physicists from Sakharov on down, lots of engineers. So let's just call it, I'm going to take your question and expand it to the STEM fields. And this is something that a lot of people have wondered, is there something about, let's call it the scientific worldview? If science is organized skepticism, maybe that can help account for the prominence of such people in the movement. The trouble that you run into when you try to sustain that argument is that at the same time as a high proportion of dissidents were from STEM fields, a very, very tiny proportion of STEM people became dissidents. Mm-hmm. So the overwhelming majority of physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists, engineers, never had anything to do with the movement. So how are you going to say that the qualities of mind, the habits of thought that are cultivated in those fields predispose people to be drawn to this movement when the overwhelming proportion of people with those habits of mind did no such thing? It's a very tricky problem to deal with. And there's another version of it, which was equally part of the conversation at the time, which is a very high proportion of dissidents were Jewish, had one or more Jewish parents. In most cases, that was about the sum of their Jewish identity. They didn't speak Jewish languages. They hadn't been schooled in Jewish texts. I mean, there was no kind of cultural apparatus. They were thoroughly immersed in the Russian language and culture. But it's really striking. Somebody once said 85% of the hardcore dissidents are Jews, and to which a poet responded, "That's not fair, it should be 50-50. This in a country where Jews were less than 1% of the population." So the same concern that I raised vis-a-vis the STEM fields would apply to that argument. Yes, it is really striking, the proportion of Jews in the movement, but that doesn't change the fact that the overwhelming majority of Soviet Jews never had anything to do with the dissident movement, didn't want to have anything to do with it. So you can't, it's not an easy thing to extrapolate from certain alleged qualities to alleged outcomes. Having said that, I did think long and hard, not so much about the scientific worldview or the mathematical mind, whatever that is. I'm probably not qualified to really say. But there are really striking affinities between the content of people's work and their approach to this rule of law strategy. And Volpin is in some ways the best illustration of that, because his own professional quest as a mathematical logician was to embrace this new movement in the 1950s called cybernetics, which is all about translating a host of different phenomenon into feedback mechanisms and algorithms and machine language learning and ways of quantifying everything from a literary text to an economic model. He was part of a much larger movement. He was also caught up in the search for what used to be known as ideal language. This is something initiated by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the idea that, as Wittgenstein put it, 90% of our confusions result from the lack of clarity of our language. Human languages are just super ambiguous. The same word can mean very different things in different contexts. It's a semantic mess. It's a jungle. And the idea was, if you could invent a language that was perfectly clear, that had none of those ambiguities that English and Russian and all other natural languages have, maybe we could actually start solving some of our philosophical problems, and maybe some other kinds of problems too. So Volpin was really dedicated to that quest. He never did invent an ideal language, but as a result of his own biographical encounters with the KGB and with the numerous mental hospitals in which he was imprisoned against his will, he bumped up against a language that he realized was a close second to an ideal language, and that was the language of Soviet law. Like ideal language, Soviet law at least attempted to express as clearly as possible what you were allowed to do, what you are forbidden to do, and what you were permitted to do. Three fundamental moral categories. And he realized that, as imperfect as it might be, Soviet law might be a language in which you could place constraints on the power of the state. That's a very mathematical approach to the idea of the rule of law and eventually to civil rights and human rights. So there is a profound connection between the way he thought as a mathematician and his role in the dissident movement. But as they say, it's an N of one. It's one guy for whom you can illustrate that deep connection. I couldn't do that with Albrecht. It wouldn't be possible. So I hate to fall back on, every case is different, but that's kind of where I ended up.
Just that here and there are courageous historians, but we're still searching. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
Welcome again.